Picture a wide plain in what is now northern Argentina, somewhere around 12,000 years ago. The grass is dry and golden, swaying in a warm wind that carries the smell of dust and animal. A small group of people, no more than a dozen, crouches behind a low rise. They are lean, sun-darkened, dressed in soft leather and pieces of hide stitched with sinew. Their hair is bound back. In their hands they hold long wooden spears tipped with chipped stone blades shaped like a fishtail. They are not shouting, they are barely breathing. And the thing they are watching, the thing they have followed for the better part of a morning, is a living tank. Its back is a dome of bony plates fused together like a giant tortoise made of stone. Its tail swings slowly as it grazes, and at the end of that tail sits a cluster of spikes the size of a clenched fist. The animal weighs as much as a small car. A single blow from that tail can shatter a human thigh. And these people, with nothing more than wood, stone, leather cords, and each other, intend to kill it. How? That is the question that haunts anyone who looks at the bones of a Glyptodont in a museum. How does a person armed with a sharpened rock take down an armored giant? The answer is not magic and not muscle. It is patience, knowledge, cooperation, and an inheritance of skill that had been refined for thousands of kilometers and hundreds of generations before this morning ever came. To understand that, we have to begin much earlier and much farther north. The first South Americans were the southern edge of one of the longest human migrations in our history. Their ancestors had crossed from Northeast Asia into the Americas across a wide, low plain of grass and shrub that connected Siberia and Alaska during the last ice age, when so much water was locked up in glaciers that sea levels were many tens of meters lower than today. Generation by generation, century by century, those people moved south. They were not on a journey in the way we imagine a journey. They were following game, water, river valleys, coastlines, weather. By around 13,000 years ago, groups carrying a recognizable toolkit had spread through much of North America. We often call the most famous of those tool makers the Clovis culture, named after a small town in New Mexico where their distinctive spear points were first identified. Their cousins, or their descendants, kept going. They threaded down the long spine of the Americas, through the tropics, into the savannas, around the great rivers, and at last out onto the open grasslands of the South. By somewhere between 13 and 12,000 years ago, perhaps a little earlier in some places, people stood at the edge of Patagonia, looking out over a world that no one of our species had ever seen before. They had reached, on foot, the far end of an entire hemisphere. In archaeological terms, we call them Paleoindians. In South America, the most recognizable signature of their presence is a stone spear point with a slightly wasted fishtail shape, often called the fishtail point or the fell point after the cave in Patagonia where it was first studied in detail. It is the southern cousin of the Clovis point, and it tells us, in chipped stone, that these were people who knew how to hunt very large animals. And there was no shortage of very large animals to hunt. The Ice Age South America they walked into was not a frozen wasteland. In the Pampas, in the open plains of what is now Argentina and Uruguay, in the steppes that stretched into Patagonia, the climate was cooler and drier than today, but it was not Arctic. It was a vast golden grassland, with patches of woodland along rivers, with lakes that came and went with the rains, with seasons of plenty and seasons of want. And across that grassland moved a caste of giants that today sounds almost mythical. There was the Glyptodont, the armored grazer we have already met, a relative of modern armadillos, but built on a scale that has no living equal. There was the Megatherium, a ground sloth as tall as a giraffe when it reared up on its hind legs, with claws like curved knives, browsing on leaves it tore down from trees. There was the Toxodon, a heavy-bodied creature shaped a little like a hippopotamus, but related to no animal alive today, grazing along rivers and lake margins. There was the macrauchenia, a long-necked, long-legged plant-eater with a strangely shortened trunk like a small, flexible snout, ambling through the open country. There were native horses, several species of them, very much real horses that lived and died on these plains long before any European brought their distant descendants back across the ocean. There were giant armadillos beside the even more giant Glyptodonts. And among all of these, hunting them, was Smilodon, the saber-toothed cat, a stocky, muscular predator with two long, curved upper fangs designed to deliver a single, deep, killing bite to a large animal's throat or belly. People walked into the middle of that world. They did not arrive as masters of it. They arrived as one more predator, smaller and weaker than most, but carrying something that the saber-tooth did not have. They carried language, memory, planning, and the ability to share a task among many hands. Now let us return to the Glyptodont, because it is the animal that best shows how cleverness met armor on the South American plains. A full-grown Glyptodont of the species Doedicurus could reach more than 3 meters in length and weigh somewhere between 1 and 2 tons. Imagine the rough volume of a small car set on 4 short, powerful legs. Its head was small for its body, low-slung, equipped with grinding teeth that worked endlessly through tough grass and low plants. Its back was covered by a great dome of bony plates called osteoderms, fused together into a single, rigid shell. This is one of the most important details. Unlike a modern armadillo, a Glyptodont could not roll itself into a ball. The armor was not flexible. It was a fortress on legs, and the animal lived inside it the way a knight lives inside plate metal. The tail was an engineering marvel on its own. In Doedicurus, the most famous of the Glyptodonts, the tail ended in a heavy club ringed with bony spikes. We know from the structure of the tail vertebrae and from microscopic damage patterns on fossilized clubs that these animals used that tail with serious force. The most likely targets were rival males of their own species, in competition for mates and territory. But it is hard to imagine any predator that would not have to think twice before approaching the rear end of such an animal. A solid hit from that club could break ribs, snap a leg, crush a skull. To a human hunter, that tail was the single most dangerous part of the prey. So why hunt such a creature at all? Because everything else about it was an invitation. A Glyptodont was slow. It could not run far. It could not climb. Its eyesight was probably modest. Its head and lower jaw were not armored in the same way as its back. Its belly, when it could be exposed, was vulnerable. Its mouth and throat were soft, and its body, once down, was a mountain of food. A single adult could feed a band of people for many days. The hide between the plates, the tendons, the fat, the bones, even the great empty shell itself, all of these had uses. The question was simply how to bring it down without dying in the attempt. That question was answered, over the course of generations, with tools and tactics, not with brute strength. The most important tool was the spear, and the most important part of the spear was the stone point lashed to its tip. South American Paleoindian hunters worked stone with extraordinary skill. They selected fine-grained materials, chert, jasper, obsidian where they could find it, sometimes carrying preferred stone from quarries that lay many days of walking away. They struck off long flakes with controlled, practiced blows, then pressure-flaked the edges with a piece of bone or antler, taking off tiny slivers to shape and sharpen the blade. The fishtail point, the signature of these southern hunters, has a slightly fluted base that helped seat it firmly into a split wooden shaft, where it was bound with wet sinew that shrank tight as it dried. The result was a weapon that was not just sharp, but designed to stay in a wound, to bleed an animal out, to disable rather than only to wound. A spear in the hand is one weapon. A spear thrown by an arm is another. But a spear launched with an atlatl is something else entirely. The atlatl is a simple, elegant device, a short stick of wood with a hook or spur at one end and a grip at the other. The hunter rests the butt of his spear against the hook, holds the grip, and throws the spear with an overhand motion that uses the atlatl as an extension of his forearm. The added leverage roughly doubles the speed and energy of the throw. A skilled user could send a heavy dart through the air with enough force to drive a stone point deep into the body cavity of a large mammal at 20 or 30 meters, well beyond the reach of any swinging tail. We know the atlatl was used across the Americas, and there is every reason to think Paleoindians in the South carried this technology with them. It was, in a real sense, the rifle of its age. There were other tools. The bola, a set of stones tied to the ends of cords joined at a central point, was used to entangle the legs of running animals. It is hard to know exactly how old this weapon is in South America, but stone weights that fit comfortably into the hand and have grooves for binding are found in many early sites, and ethnographic records from much later peoples of the Pampas describe the use of bolas to bring down animals in motion. Whether or not the very first hunters used bolas in exactly the same form, the principle of throwing weighted cords to trip prey was almost certainly part of the repertoire. And there were tools that we tend to forget when we think of Stone Age hunting. There was rope, made from twisted plant fibers and from rawhide. There was fire, used to flush animals out of cover and to drive them in chosen directions. There was the landscape itself, read as a tool. A steep drop, a soft mud bank, a narrow gully between rocks, a marsh where a heavy animal would sink and a light human would not. All of these were weapons too, if you knew how to herd a beast into them. Pit traps, dug carefully in places where a Glyptodont was likely to walk, then covered with brush and grass, could break a leg or simply trap the animal in place long enough for hunters to close in. These are reasonable inferences from the toolkit and from later hunting practices around the world. We cannot always prove that a specific group dug a specific pit, but the combination of ability, motive, and opportunity is very strong. What made all of this possible, what turned tools into a hunt, was cooperation. A Glyptodont could not be killed by one person with one weapon. It could be killed by a group of people who knew exactly what each other was going to do. Imagine the hunt again, with that knowledge in place. Several days before, scouts have been watching a herd, or perhaps just a single old male, marking where it feeds, where it drinks, where it sleeps. They have noticed that it walks the same path between a thicket and a shallow lake every afternoon. They have noticed, too, a place along that path where the ground drops away into a soft, marshy hollow. The plan takes shape around the landscape. On the day of the hunt, a few of the youngest and fastest move out wide, taking position downwind so the animal will not catch their scent. Older hunters work closer, in pairs, keeping low. A small fire is started at exactly the right moment in dry grass on the far side of the animal, with the wind in their favor. The smoke and the sudden crackle send the Glyptodont moving in the only direction left open to it, the path it already knows, toward the soft ground. As it reaches the mud, its weight betrays it. The short legs sink, the body lurches, the tail swings, but the swing is wild because the footing is wrong. That is the moment. From the brush along the path, several hunters rise, dart throwers already cocked. Heavy spears with fishtail points fly in from the sides, aimed at the soft flank just behind the front leg, at the belly where the armor gives way, at the unprotected throat below the small head. The first hits do not kill. They do not need to. They wound, they bleed, they slow. Another wave of darts follows. The animal tries to turn, tries to reach a tormentor with that terrible tail, but the marsh holds it. The hunters keep their distance, keep their rhythm, keep their patience. They have been here, in their imagination, dozens of times before. They have rehearsed it as children with sticks. They have heard it described by uncles who hunted before they were born. They know that the worst mistake is to rush in. Eventually, the great body slows, the breath rattles, the legs fold. One of the senior hunters approaches from the side, behind the line of the swing, with a long, heavy, thrusting spear, and drives it in beneath the rim of the shell, into the lungs. The plain becomes very quiet. The fire on the far slope burns itself out in the damp grass. Birds, which had gone silent, begin to call again. Then the real work begins. Killing a giant is the short part of the day. Using one takes much longer. A Glyptodont was a walking pantry. The meat alone could feed an extended family for days, and what could not be eaten fresh would be cut into thin strips and dried over low smoky fires or in the sun to be carried with the band as it moved. The fat was perhaps even more precious than the meat, because in a world without farming, animal fat was a key source of dense calories, the engine that kept a hunter strong on cold mornings and long marches. Bones were saved for marrow, cracked open with stones to get at the soft tissue inside, and the heavier ones became raw material for tools, awls, points, scrapers, hammers. Tendons were peeled out and dried for sinew, the thread of the ancient world, used to bind spear points, sew clothing, lash poles. The skin from the soft parts of the body, the belly and under the legs, could be worked into leather. Nothing of value was left behind that did not have to be. And then there was the shell. Imagine standing over an empty Glyptodont carapace, a dome of bone 2 meters or more across, with a natural opening underneath. It is one of the more remarkable possibilities of this story that human beings, looking at such a structure, would see in it a ready-made roof. There are fossil sites in South America where ancient Glyptodont shells have been found in positions suggesting use as shelters, sometimes with bones of people or signs of fire associated with them. The interpretation is debated, and one should be careful, but the idea is not fantasy. A propped-up Glyptodont shell, perhaps lined with hides, would have been a tough little hut against rain and wind, a temporary lodge near a kill site, or a regular camp. Whether or not any specific shell was used this way, the broader point holds. To these people, a giant was not only food, it was material. It was, in a sense, architecture on the hoof. The Glyptodont was the most spectacular of their prey, but it was not the only giant they faced. The ground sloth, the megatherium, was just as imposing in a different way. Standing on its hind legs to feed from the high branches of a tree, it could reach the height of a giraffe. Its long arms ended in massive, curved claws. It was slow but extremely strong, and unlike the Glyptodont, it had no armor. A hunter who could reach the body could, in principle, wound it, but reaching the body meant getting past those arms. There are sites in South America, such as the famous locality of Campo Laborde in the Argentine Pampas, where butchered remains of a giant sloth have been found together with stone tools, dated to within the window we are talking about. The animal was eaten. How it was killed, we can only reconstruct. The most likely scenario is something like the Glyptodont hunt scaled to a different problem. A group of hunters wearing the animal down with thrown darts from a safe distance, then closing in when blood loss and exhaustion had taken the fight out of it. Toxodons, those heavy hippo-shaped grazers, would have been hunted along their watering places, perhaps trapped in mud or driven into deeper water where a swimming human with a thrusting spear had advantages over a struggling beast. Mative horses were swifter and trickier, but herd animals can be moved, and a group of hunters who understood wind and terrain could push small numbers of horses toward a cliff edge, a narrow ravine, a soft sandbar by a river, places where speed turned into a trap. Macrauchenias and smaller game filled in the spaces. There was, in this world, real abundance for those who knew how to read it. It is important not to imagine this as a constant carnival of giant kills. Hunting megafauna was high reward, but also high effort, high risk, and probably infrequent. Most days were quieter. Most meals were smaller. The daily life of these people was built less on epic hunts and more on 1,000 smaller skills repeated season after season. Their camps were usually light, designed to be moved. A typical shelter could be a frame of bent saplings or driftwood, covered with hides or thatched with grass, sometimes set in the lee of a rocky outcrop or near the mouth of a cave for added protection. In Patagonia and other regions where rock shelters were available, people used them again and again over thousands of years, leaving behind layers of charcoal, bone, and stone chips that today let archaeologists read their lives like a slow biography. In open country, the dwelling was simpler, more transient, perhaps no more than a windbreak and a hearth. Water was a constant calculation. The grasslands of South America are not deserts, but they can be dry, and good water in a known place was a kind of treasure. People learned where the springs ran, where the dew gathered, where shallow ponds formed after the rains. They probably carried water in containers made from animal stomachs or bladders, materials that we rarely find preserved because they decay quickly. They knew which plants, dug up at the right time, held moisture in tubers and roots. Food, day to day, was much more than mammoth-sized meat. People gathered wild seeds, fruits, nuts, roots, tubers, eggs, insects, shellfish where coasts and rivers permitted, fish where they could be caught. The diet was broad and opportunistic. A successful band lived not on the strength of a few great hunters, but on the steady contributions of women, men, elders, and children, each gathering something, each watching for the small chances that the land offered. Small game, lizards, rodents, birds, was probably more reliable than giants. A Glyptodont might come once a season. A nestful of eggs or a basket of seeds came again and again. Their tools matched their lives. Beyond the dramatic fishtail points, they made scrapers for cleaning hides, gravers for working bone, drills, knives, hammerstones, and grinding slabs. Bone and antler became needles, awls, projectile points, fishhooks, ornaments. Plant fibers were twisted into cordage. Wood was shaped into shafts, throwing sticks, digging sticks. The toolkit was small enough to carry on the move, but rich enough to address every recurring problem in the daily round. Clothing was a quiet, central technology. We sometimes picture Ice Age hunters in heavy furs because we have absorbed images from Europe or Siberia. But the South American plains in this period were temperate, not polar. People needed protection from sun, wind, dust, thorns, insects, and the chill of nights and rain, not from blizzards. Their clothing was probably light, made of well-worked hides, perhaps sometimes simple cloth from plant fibers, sewn together with sinew and bone needles. Footwear was almost certainly made of leather, wrapped or stitched to fit the rough country. Body decoration likely existed, but it was the simple kind that survives in many hunting cultures: painted designs, beads of bone or shell, perhaps tattoos. There were no jaguar headdresses, no feathered war shields, none of the imagery we associate with much later civilizations in the region. That richer material culture was a project of thousands of years still to come. Mobility was the rule. A band moved with the seasons, with the animals, with the rains. It might return to the same camp year after year, and yet spend most of its time in motion, walking measured distances each day, leaving small traces. This is one of the reasons their sites are so difficult to find. They were people who tried not to weigh down the land they passed over. When evening came, when the day's work was done and the fire was built up against the cooling air, the band gathered around the flames. Fire was their oldest invention and one of their most important. It cooked their food, warmed their bodies, hardened their wooden spear points, and held the night a step further away. Animals that would not approach a person alone would not approach a circle of people around a fire. Fire, in the dark, was a wall. And around the fire, the most fundamental human technology was practiced, which is to say, speech. We have no recordings of their language. We do not know the names they used for themselves, for their gods if they had gods, for the great animals they hunted. But we can say with great confidence that they talked, told stories, explained, joked, argued, taught, sang. Every cooperative hunt we have just imagined was built on top of countless evenings of talking. A child watching the flames listened as an uncle described how a wounded toxodon turns, how to read the mud at the edge of a lake, where the hard stone for spear points could be found 3 days' walk to the north. A grandmother explained which plants healed and which made you sleep. These were not lectures. They were the slow weaving of a culture, story by story, problem by problem. What they believed about the spirits behind the world we cannot say in detail without inventing. We know that hunter-gatherer peoples across the world, in every climate, tend to relate to their prey not only as food, but as a kind of partner, an animal that, in some sense, allows itself to be taken if treated with respect. Bones are sometimes returned to the earth or to the water with care. Certain parts may be reserved for elders, for the hearth, for special use. The first acts after a kill are often quiet ones. It is reasonable to suspect that the hunters who killed the Glyptodont did not see themselves as conquerors of a thing, but as participants in a relationship with an animal whose blood now mixed with the wet grass at their feet. We can suspect this. We cannot prove it. So we say it gently. For a long stretch of time, perhaps 2,000 or 3,000 years, this way of life and this caste of giants coexisted across the southern half of the Americas. And then, in a span that on the scale of geology is almost a blink, the giants were gone. By around 10 to 12,000 years ago, depending on the species and the region, the Glyptodonts, the ground sloths, the toxodons, the macrauchenias, the native horses, the saber-toothed cats, all had vanished from the South American mainland. The grasslands were still there, the seasons were still there, the people, for the most part, were still there, but the great beasts were not. What happened? This is one of the most discussed questions in the science of human prehistory, and there is, honestly, no single tidy answer. The evidence supports a combination of causes. The end of the last ice age was a time of significant climatic change. Patterns of rainfall shifted. Vegetation zones moved. Some of the giant species had probably been specialized for landscapes and plant communities that were now reorganizing under their feet. Cooler steppes gave way to different mixes of grass and shrub. Water tables changed. A large animal with a long lifespan, a slow reproductive rate, and a narrow diet is exactly the kind of creature that struggles when its world is rearranged. Many of the megafauna fit that description. At the same time, humans were on the land, hunting. And while a small band might take only one Glyptodont a season, the impact of those small bands, multiplied across many generations, may have been substantial, especially for species that already had low birth rates and were under climate stress. The most common scientific position today is not that humans alone killed off the megafauna, and not that climate alone did, but that the combination, hunting pressure pressing on populations already weakened by a changing environment, was the fatal cocktail. Some species might have hung on a little longer in refuges than others. Some might have been pushed over the edge by a single bad century. The disappearance was uneven, but its direction was the same. The people themselves did not vanish. This is a central point that is too often forgotten when we talk about ancient hunters and their lost prey. The hunters who killed the last Glyptodonts did not die out. Their children grew up in a world where those animals were already memories told by grandparents. Those children adapted. They turned more fully to the resources that remained: smaller game, plants, fish, shellfish along the coasts and rivers. Some groups began to develop techniques of gardening, then of farming, in different regions and at different paces. Others remained mobile hunter-gatherers for many more thousands of years, refining their relationship with the post-Ice Age landscape. From these continuous, unbroken lines descend the many indigenous peoples of South America, the peoples who were already long established when European ships arrived in the 16th century, and who, despite everything that has happened since, are alive today. The Mapuche, the Tehuelche, the Selknam, the Guarani, the Quechua, the Aymara, the many peoples of the Amazon basin, and so many others, all carry, in some way, a thread that reaches back to those first families who walked out onto the southern plains and looked at a Glyptodont and thought, "We can do this together." What can we take from a hunt that ended 12,000 years ago? Several things, perhaps. One is a simple correction of our imagination. The first South Americans were not desperate primitives. They were a sophisticated, mobile, intelligent culture, equipped with tools tuned to their world and minds tuned to each other. They could plan days in advance. They could read landscape, weather, and animal behavior at a level of detail that most modern people have lost. They thrived in a country that to us would seem alien and dangerous, and they did so without any of the technologies we tend to think of as essential. Another is a quiet respect for the prey. A Glyptodont was not a monster to be slain in a story. It was a fellow creature in a shared world, a great gentle grazer that ate grass and lived its life until it met, in its old age or its bad luck, a group of small, thoughtful beings who needed what its body could give. The respect ran both ways. The animal, in dying, fed children. The children, in growing, told the story. The story, told around enough fires, became the kind of knowledge that we now read, very imperfectly, from chipped stone and old bone. And a third, perhaps the most useful for our own time, is the role of cooperation. Nothing about that hunt worked because of one person's strength or one person's idea. It worked because a dozen people moved as one, each one knowing what the others were doing, each one accepting their role, each one willing to trust the rest. The fishtail point in the museum case is beautiful, but it is not what brought down the giant. What brought down the giant was the long, patient, mostly invisible web of human relationships behind that point. The language, the memory, the shared planning, the willingness to wait, the discipline of holding back the spear until the moment was right. When the last sunlight fades on those ancient plains, in our imagination, we see the band sitting together near the body of the animal they have killed. The fire is being built. The smell of cooking meat is beginning to rise. Someone, probably an older hunter, is explaining to a younger one exactly what went well and what nearly went wrong. Children are watching, wide-eyed, hungry, listening. The night that surrounds them is full of stars that we would still recognize. The country around them is full of life that we would not. And the hunters themselves, the men and women whose names we will never know, sit in a circle that, in some real sense, has never quite been broken. We are descended from people who learned to do exactly this kind of thing somewhere on the long road behind us. To watch them in our mind, calmly, respectfully, without exaggeration, is to remember something true about who we are. They were the first South Americans. They hunted giants. They did it together, and they did it well.